I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I've been waiting to do an episode on abundance for some time now, but I wasn't finding a way to tie the buzz to our genre of local politics. And then, for unrelated reasons, I landed two interviews that entirely by accident spoke to the friction the abundance agenda faced when it confronted local politics. This October, DC Policy Center released a report called Strengthening State-Level Policy for Growing Housing Supply, where they looked at creating a research and advocacy ecosystem to support policymaking that leads to more home building. I had asked DC Policy Center Executive Director Yashim Sain, a former DC finance official and now a frequent guest on I Hate Politics, if she would explain the report, and she agreed. At about the same time, the Washington Post wrote an editorial about how the DC Council was holding back progress itself with its cautious approach to allowing full use of driverless cars within the city, without any mention of the fact that Post owner Jeff Bezos had an autonomous vehicle company called Zoox, which had an application in front of the city government. The editorial reminded me of a previous I Hate Politics episode where we looked at how Uber's entry into Washington, D.C., as innovative and promising as it was for transportation, also tore through the public square in terms of the impact on treatment of labor, not to forget that having more cars on the road was likely a top sin for climate change politics. The Uber episode included 2 of 3 authors of a book called Disrupting DC. The one I could not get for the old show was George Washington University urban geographer Declan Cullen. So I called him, and he agreed to join the show as well. It was only after I had finished interviewing Cullen did I realize the abundance connection. Here were 2 items on the abundance agenda: housing and technology innovation, meeting the friction of local politics. And Cullen and Sain came at it from different political perspectives. I had to put them together. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
Walked this road about 1,000 times. You think by now I would have got it right. Broken pieces to pick up again. Cycle back to where we began. But I don't mind. Maybe I don't mind suffocating, but I love the home to you every time.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's 2 new single releases, I Don't Mind and Tell Me What You Want. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com.
Suffocating, but I love the coming home to you every time. Like a moth drawn to a flame.
Yashim Sain, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me.
DC Policy Center, which you head, has recently released a report called Strengthening State Level Policy for Growing Housing Supply. Obviously, we're talking about abundance and actualizing that agenda. Why is this the next policy frontier?
Housing scarcity is a deep problem, not just in DC, but everywhere in the country. We've seen in recent years, alongside this abundance movement, a lot of campaigns, initiatives to increase housing supply. And when you look at the landscape of that policy making, you kind of have this barbell. On the one side, you have the federal government and federal government policy that's conducted through HUD. And when you look at that environment, you see a number of things. You see a very strong presence of affordable housing advocacy that's done through sort of the low-income housing tax credits program. And then you have a system that moves extremely slowly. You know, federal government can make changes to the entire housing world in DC, but getting that to the entire housing world in the country, but getting there takes a very long time. There is a bill by Elizabeth Warren and Tim Kaine trying to use state-level infrastructure dollars either as a carrot or a stick for localities to do more. So you have this federal policy machine, could be very effective, takes a long time. It's very hard to get things done at the Hill right now. Then you have local level initiatives. There are 30,000 plus local governments in the country. And you see a lot of missing middle stuff. So in Arlington, you see, get rid of single family zoning, ADUs, a lot of successful campaigns. But when you look at these campaigns, even when they're successful, their immediate contribution to housing supply is really small. Because if you were to take, let's say, Ward 3 and get rid of single family housing there, it will take you years to make any meaningful difference. Similarly, legalizing ADUs has really not added that much to the housing supply. We hear interesting things like, in DC, you can now build in alleys. And one impediment to building in alleys is nobody would give the alley a name. So you don't have an address, so you cannot build. The motivation we have at the DC Policy Center to be engaged in this is because first, the environment we work in DC is a state, a locality, a school district, all of these things all together. So when I think about reforming housing policy, zoning is one small aspect of it. It's an important aspect of it, but a small aspect of it. We're thinking in DC, and when we talk about housing policy, we're thinking about tax assessments. We're thinking about infrastructure investment. We're thinking about environmental policy. We're thinking about building codes. We're thinking about tax abatements. We're thinking about all these other levers that you can pull at the state level to make significant changes in the way we build housing very quickly. And there are examples of it in the nation. Housing reforms in Minnesota, they started at the local level, but then ended up being big reforms at the state level. California, that has suffered from Proposition 13 and all these things that really killed housing production, terrible zoning policies in some parts of California. The state is now telling localities to have housing goals. And if they do not meet these housing goals, the state can interfere. We need to see more of this level of action. And the beauty of having a state level intervention is for advocates, you no longer have 30,000 governments and zoning boards you need to deal with. You have 51. But it will take some work to get there because policy work at the state level is very different from policy work at the local level. Policy work at the local level is a lot of grassroots campaigns. Put on your signs and you go to the city council. There is really not a housing committee. There are no committees. City councils are small. And then you can push legislation in a way that's very different from how you have to work at the state level. You have to be close to the committee. You have to build these relationships. But moving some policy action to the state level is going to be tremendously important for the abundance agenda to execute its goals. I think the biggest risk for the abundance agenda is we have all this energy around it. 5 years pass and it has done nothing. And remember, abundance is not about a new way of thinking about economics. It's just supply side economics. It's been around since John Baptist say, but it's about talking to progressive politicians about these things. In the past, when you think about housing conversations, it was all, let's line the pockets of the developers, it was all in this like, my business needs, my company needs, my project needs. Abundance is not about the project or the developer, it's about the consumer.
There is a sense that housing policy is a locality-based idea. The supply side folks are saying, oh, housing is a commodity, subject to supply and demand. But on the other hand, we also say that your home is your home. It's your dream home. If you're commoditizing your dream, it's a really difficult sell politically.
I wouldn't characterize it as commoditizing, but for sure that we all have feelings about, this is my home, I invested in it, that's why I want my neighborhood to look a certain way. But I will give you the example of education. Education advocacy until the No Child Left Behind Act was entirely done at the school board level. States have no control over local school districts' decisions. The outcomes were not particularly bright. The labor unions had a very strong hold on the school districts and school boards. School boards had their own the optimization function that had nothing to do with the kids' learning outcomes. Then came the No Child Left Behind Act. It did something very simple. It just basically told the states, it is your job now to measure how well the kids are doing.
Do you think that worked?
It changed the advocacy.
For sure. But did it appreciably change anything about learning, student outcomes, or any one of those?
Absolutely. And we had the Nations Report Card, the NAEP tests, right? So when you look at the first 10 years after the initiation of the NAEP, you had significant improvements. I think the big challenge that we had was the pandemic. And we're still suffering from that. But you don't know the counterfactual, which was a terrible, terrible system all around the country, unless you lived in a rich neighborhood where the property taxes can pay for your schools. That notion is still there, but the states, what I'm talking about is expanding the advocacy and the role of advocacy. Education advocacy was basically yelling in front of the school boards. Now it's at the state level. Some of it you may not like education saving accounts, you may not like DEI initiatives, but it's happening.
Now we are teaching to a test that may or may not reflect learning. You have said yourself in your report that advocacy tends to be fragmented in this area. And you're wanting to bring together so many people. How did Minnesota do this? Why was Minnesota successful? California is a different problem. So California was successful because it got really, really bad.
Correct.
Right? And then something had to give, right? In Minnesota, it got bad, but it didn't get California bad, but they did come together somehow.
Minnesota is a really interesting case. We have a small case study of what happened there. It started actually at the local level. Minneapolis had passed a plan called the 2040 plan, which was at the local level, ending single-family zoning, allowing triplexes, cutting back on parking mandates. By the way, parking mandates are really effective. Cutting back parking mandates make a huge difference. But this plan, as soon as it was announced and adopted, there was a lawsuit against it. And the people who did not like this plan used the Environmental Rights Act to freeze parts of it. The court case actually came in favor of the reform. So that created the precedence for this to be built upon. Once the Minnesota case started getting attention, it was a political opportunity for state-level legislators to piggyback on its success. You started seeing bills both on the House, on the Senate side, starting to adopt the reforms in Minneapolis at the state level. And there were 4 things that came together to push this forward. First, there was a lot of state-level research. You need good research. You need to build a big tent coalition. It wasn't just construction lobbyists. It was environmental folks, because the best thing you can do for the environment is build dams. The social justice folks were part of it. YIMBY groups were part of it. So it was a broad coalition. The litigation gave it very strong legs. And there were also a very strong communications campaign. Tons of polling, tons of communications, simple messaging. So it's sort of this perfect storm for good policy change came together and it happened.
For a long time, I had thought that the problem, the housing supply problem, would be solved with what I called a grand bargain. And the grand bargain was going to be between builders and developers on one hand and rent control activists on the other. That they would somehow come together, on the one hand upzone, and on the other hand undertake some rent control measures that provided immediate relief. That was going to be a grand bargain. And of course, I was absolutely wrong. There is no grand bargain. And one of the things that I find actually is that the development community is surprisingly missing from advocacy. And in fact, in your report too, they are surprisingly missing from the advocacy you are suggesting. Ordinarily, if an industry is affected, that industry stands up. Individually, developers are pretty aggressive politically, but collectively, they seem to have a real weakness for collective action.
I think maybe part of it is that the nature of our region. In Minnesota, the key research organization, Minnesota Housing Partnership and the Housing Affordability Institute. Housing Affordability Institute is essentially a shop that's funded by developers and construction industry. So, it's not true everywhere. I think we kind of have our own unique history. Maryland is slightly different because its economy varies so greatly from one end of the state to the other. But if you parts of Prince George's County and parts of Montgomery County, the number one industry is just like in DC, is space. We don't really have manufacturing. We don't have technology. You have space. Like you can say, oh, we have the healthcare industry. No, you sell real estate to the healthcare industry. And in some ways, it's a little bit better form. Like you have Johns Hopkins feeding into this. But DC, even more so, we sell space. And I think the engagement of the developer community is also shaped by the history. There was nothing happening in the region between 1967 to 2007. The riots were the end of DC. We survived the two world wars. We survived all the way through the riots, but the riots were the end of things. And then when things started coming back in 2007...
I was trying to buy a house in 2003 in DC, and I couldn't afford it because nothing was affordable in DC for somebody like me that has just got my first teaching job.
Of course, because nothing was happening. Nothing was being built. What I'm talking about is construction. The values were like, but in 2003, I moved here in 1995. You didn't go anywhere beyond 14th Street. That was like the absolute, and then Capitol Hill started coming back. The millennials started coming. And then you remember Capitol Hill was a place where every row house had 3 units. And then people started buying them and turning them into single family homes. So if anything, the number of housing units declined just by elimination of these subdivisions. What happened between 2007 and through the pandemic is you had this magical moment of people still moving into the region, interest rates extremely low, construction costs under control. So in the meantime, the government started layering all these legislation. Building energy performance standards, green buildings, all of this environmental stuff. The permitting system still sucks. I just heard a story that, one developer, they were thinking of building, let's say 200 town houses, okay? But 4 styles, A, B, C, D. 200 houses, but only 4 models. This went to permitting. Half the units went to permit issuer Joe. The other went to permit issuer Jill. Joe said, great. And Jill did not issue the permit. Like, this is crazy. So I think the system was cracking, but we didn't see it because it was like, the finance part was working. Right now, the finance part is not working. The number of housing permits in DC, I don't know in Montgomery County, but I suspect it is the same.
Yep.
In DC, we used to see about 7,000 to 8,000 housing permits per year. Right now, it's under 2,000 for this year.
Given all of this, why isn't the local development community acting more aggressively, able to coordinate their advocacy more effectively to get the things that you're wanting?
First, I think there are some examples, at least in DC. The TOPA reform was one. I think the development committee was well organized. They used our research very effectively and extensively. And, they wanted 26 things. They got 18, which is an incredibly high number given the history. So I think there is more of a coordination that's happening.
TOPA advocacy is so narrow. I'm not saying it's not important. Your larger SLI agenda, the abundance agenda, is not really supported by them.
I'm a part of a think tank. We have a mission. Our mission is not to solve the problem for a particular community. Our mission is to make life better, cheaper, easier for everyone in DC.
Sure. Public welfare. Public welfare.
Yeah. When you look at other states, when you look at the business community, you see a broad engagement of the business community in issues beyond their own businesses. So you see a lot of businesses investing in think tanks or advocacy groups that are focusing on K-12 education. There is a return to them. They want better schools. They want better workforce. There is a return to them, but it's not like give me a tax abatement kind of return. It's a long-term investment.
See, the tax abatement advocacy you get, that's not a problem. But it's this broader advocacy that they're completely missing from. And I've asked several developers, and they don't want to answer that question.
I don't know. They're giving us money, so I cannot say they're not engaged.
Okay, all right. In Montgomery County, the government introduced rent stabilization. They introduced increased impact tax, and they have also increased now the building energy performance standards, which are important from an environmental point of view, but very expensive. Three big burdens, and they have not been able to stop it. The theory of democracy, theory of politics is that the powerful win. Developers seemingly are powerful. But in this case, they are not getting what they want. Do you have a sense of why that is?
We need to turn to the political science literature to find our answers, right? So you're more of an expert in there than I am. But I do think that there's a lot to be said about the dynamics of local politics and how people vote. Politicians can do a lot of things and not pay a price for it. We form our political views not necessarily through ideology, but we pick a little here, we pick a little there. And the framing matters. The resistance to development is very much real at the local level. In DC, interviewing developers, housing providers, land use lawyers, architects, that's what we've been doing in the last 2 months. I am shocked that this industry still exists. The stuff that they need to go through.
One of your recommendations is to align strategies and approaches across state lines. In the Washington DMV region, this has been a major, major problem. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments does great transportation work, but its housing work is mainly demand analysis, maybe some climate protection, but not really about supply. They are actually very deliberately not touching that problem with a barge pole. But you want alignment. It is extraordinarily difficult. In fact, if there is a project, they become competitive over it, right? As we saw with Amazon HQ2.
Even before COG, there was actually a group put together with support from developers to have more coordination across the metro area, because the housing market is one.
This coordination on housing policy, and particularly around taxation, regulatory burdens, developers are playing that off. The problem with Montgomery County, for example, they have a 27,000 housing unit preliminary approval list. They're not building.
Yeah, they're not building because they're not going to get the return.
We understand why, but who's going to fix it? What is the fix here?
The theory behind moving the responsibilities to the state level is that states will not be beholden to local political dynamics, that they don't, state level action may care less about your NIMBY groups.
I think that's a good hypothesis. I don't know where that coalition is going to come from, because the governor did not get his housing bills this year.
Our approach in this paper is a little bit more optimistic than your take, and we're all traumatized about housing policy in the region, so I get it. But in the paper, we have maybe 6 or 7 different examples of very successful state-level networks that are in areas like education, like in labor, like in tax policy. And some of them are bipartisan, some of them are very partisan. But one thing that unites them together is that they have state-level coordinated action that has been tremendously successful.
ALEC, you use the conservative legislative group, their successes as an example of focusing on at state level policy. Why are they more successful in the arenas that they are interested in, which is gun policy or budget policy? Why is housing advocacy so fragmented?
Our theory in this paper is that housing advocacy is fragmented because housing policy is fragmented. Even without federal action, what we're saying is it is worth thinking about state level policies, because even if your zoning is local, your building code is still state. Your permitting is generally state. Your environmental policy is state. And, the states have the ability to preempt environmental legislation that localities adopt, right? They can do that.
Yes, they can. But the problem with that is that the ghost of Jane Jacobs is going to come right back.
Well, when that happens, I will quit my job. How about that?
Yashim Sain, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun.
So see the night that we met is playing in my head. I can't help but fall.
That was Yashim Sain, Executive Director of the DC Policy Center, which has a new report on how to execute one goal on the abundance agenda, increasing housing supply. A link to the report, Strengthening State-Level Policy for Growing Housing Supply, is in the show notes. I'm Sunil Dasgupta, and I'll be back with Declan Cullen, George Washington University geographer, who has been studying how cities react to and function when confronted with the promise of new and disruptive technology.
I'm just holding your hand. Universe got bigger plans. See you in the next life. I'll think of you when I get high. I miss those big lights. Wish I never made you cry. See you in the next life. I promise you I'll get it right. I'll get it right.
Declan Cullen, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
You are one of the authors of a book you wrote a few years ago on the entry of Uber into the Washington, D.C. market. And while Uber brought some conveniences, there are some severe public good deficiencies that you point out in your book. We are now in episode 2, which is driverless cars are trying to get into DC. Waymo has been testing its cars in DC for several months, I think close to 2 years now. And the Amazon company Zoox is trying to start that process. What is going on?
When we wrote this book, came out in 2023, but we really started doing the research probably in 2015, 2016. And at the time, AVs, driverless cars, however we discussed them, were imminent. There was some testing back in 2015, 16, 17, 18. There was lots of discussion. There was legislation. Everyone was like, they're going to be here right now. And they still haven't arrived.
AVs are autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, but the definition of autonomous is also tricky because there's levels of autonomy.
Cruise control and hands off the wheel.
Exactly. There's nobody in the car. It's just you and a robot. I've seen the cars driving around the city, especially the Waymo ones. All different parts of the city, actually, I've kind of encountered them now. I was recently paying attention to the question around Waymo and Zoox. Can we fully legalize safely autonomous cars? So no driver behind the wheel, because in the current mode, testing is allowed on DC streets, but there must be a driver behind the wheel and present at all times. The Autonomous Vehicles Act back in 2012, which established the idea that testing was allowed. And then they proposed various amendments. There was one in 2019, which was to make the testing more rigorous, where they would test and how, who's liable if there's accidents, safety standards, all these kinds of questions. And actually, they're all online, all those debates around the 2019 amendment. They're very, very interesting because you see the kinds of positions of various people. So Uber, for example, objected to the amendment, saying that I wrote it down, unduly limits or impedes the advancement and public use of this technology. And that's been the standard industry idea. Uber, and there's like a self-driving coalition for safer streets, which is largely an industry group of like car manufacturers and various tech companies that have interest, have submitted like various kinds of model legislation that they would like to see adopted, right? And the standard view they've always taken is that, DC is being, over protective. There's too much legislation, too much red tape, and it's not allowing kind of like innovation to. I don't really buy that kind of point of view. And so while we are critical in the book of DC, in many ways you could say like they took a fairly tempered approach, especially around AVs. They legalized testing with the idea that later they would legalize fully autonomous vehicles. But they haven't gotten that far yet. And I think like we're back really in this kind of similar debate we had in 2015 and 16 and right up until 2019. The Washington Post editorial from a couple of weeks ago, where they took this position that the city is dragging its heels. So they said, Waymo's been testing for 18 months, but there's no end in sight to the roadblocks erected by local politicians. And that the result of this behavior will be preventable traffic fatality.
Is it legally necessary, given current law, that there in fact be an operator inside the machine itself?
Under current law, my understanding is that it is, because they've only legislated to allow testing, and the testing specifies that there must be a driver. And so if it's an autonomous vehicle, it must have somebody behind the wheel. And so the issue at the moment is like, well, let's just remove the person because we've done enough testing to prove that this technology is feasible and is safe enough, right?
Okay.
The main debates about this often are quite like the limits of the safety. So we can say that they're safer than like having people behind the wheel. And that I think might well be true in many cases. There have been concerns around pedestrians in other cities, around cyclists, around emergency vehicles, and just how they navigate the city. But I think like one of the main objections there is not just safety, it's also things like liability. Who's responsible when the car crashes?
On the one hand is the claim that these are safer as a consequence of having all these sensors. On the other hand, technology will fail at some point. There will be some case where the technology will not work, will malfunction, the machine will break down, something will happen. And at that time, who has liability? Who has responsibility? That is the murky part. So the responsibility and the safety issues are sort of at each other. They're trading off.
We can say, well, there will be less crashes than there will be if we have autonomous vehicles. I think that has to be proven, not claimed. I also think like sometimes what we do in these debates, and I do think this is an important point of seemingly abstract, is that we jump ahead to a city that's full of autonomous vehicles, right? Like that everybody is using them and everybody has access to them, not thinking about, okay, well, the vast majority of people are actually going to be driving normal cars or on mopeds, as is the case in the city, or bicycles or walking. And I mean, if you navigate the streets of DC on a regular basis, you'll see it is often pure chaos, right?
Is there a transition management regime that companies are offering?
I don't think it's that organized in the sense that like it's just kind of considered once the legislation is passed, the cars start operating and it will work out as it works out. One of the reasons actually I think they often choose DC, well, there's probably two related reasons. One is that the city is an interesting testing ground. It's very multimodal. It's got strong public transit. It's a complicated street system for many people, like the traffic circles and the diagonals, the avenues. It's got very variable weather conditions. But two, I think like part of it is that like it's the capital, and so like it makes these things very visible to politicians and so on living in the city, and that can be like an important pressure point when we're thinking about how to legalize these things on a more kind of national scale. When I first started talking about this stuff back in like 2015 or 16, in fact, the reason why I got interested in this topic at all is because we were doing work on Uber. I started interviewing drivers and asking them about how they felt about their status as independent contractor versus employees, how they felt about, working in the gig economy and so on and so forth. And loads of them mentioned to me like, well, it doesn't really matter because, my job is going to be obsolete in a couple of years. There'll just be driverless cars everywhere. And I started thinking, well, what's going on here? What's behind it? And thinking a lot more about the technology. And Uber, for example, made some very outlandish claims about the future of cities, right? They had this paper, Uber Elevate, in 2016, which was all these like drone quadcopters, and which anyone who's older than like 20 can remember iterations of this, right? Like I was born in the 80s. I remember growing up watching a show Beyond the Year 2000, which was full of flying cars. And I remember thinking, wow, when the year 2000 comes, it's going to be amazing. And then when it came, being like just disappointed, right? And there's actually a long history of this. There's a couple of books, Peter Norton's book, Autonorama. There's a few others which talk about this gap between what's promised and what happens. And he makes the argument, and we largely do in the book, that we need to think about these kinds of promises as not just technological promises, but they're a form of politics, but also a form of economics. They're like boosterism. Uber tells everybody we're going to bring you the future, and people, especially venture capital companies, pump money into the business thinking, wow, we're going to get in on a piece of, the future, the ground floor of all this stuff. And then it never materializes. But by then we've moved on to something else.
I don't think there is a real evaluation process. It has to be on one side boosterism and on the other side Luddite.
I'm not averse to technology. I think the idea of AVs is a very useful one. But I am against the idea of blindingly accepting the promises of companies. Slowing down is really key here. Like, the DC City Council taking its time is precisely a result of having understood and internalized the last 10 years of tech companies and cities and thinking, okay, we really need to get this right rather than just let them in and let them operate however they want to. We need to be clear about safety standards. We need to understand the effect on congestion, on emergency vehicles, on pedestrians, on cyclists. And I think claiming that the cars are safer, we need more evidence.
According to the Washington Post editorial, Waymo's data shows that they are safer, but there's competing data from Tesla that shows that it is not, correct?
And that it's getting more unsafe, And then you consider questions of, can they be hacked? The discussion of driverless cars has always been framed as a technology question or a safety question around technology. And technology always wins that debate because we equate technology with progress and the future. And you can't be against the future. The framework is that the technology exists and we apply politics to the technology and regulation and policy and so on and so forth. But I think we can and we should do a different reading of technology and think of the technology itself as a form of politics from the very beginning. Not an apolitical technological entity that gets built that later gets subject to politics. In the Washington Post article, for example, they're like, well, who's really causing this problem is far left activists who are worried that people will stop using public transit. They just say that. And I'm like, well, that's actually a huge problem.
Tech companies are going to obviously make the claim that those who oppose them are radical loonies. Who is buying the technology take and who is buying the Declan take?
Me and my colleagues engaging with this work and talking about it and trying to write publicly about it and so on is to be part of that debate and shaping that debate. And I think since the 2010s to today, we've seen DC really shift its position. It went from, we are just opening the door to these companies that can do whatever they want because, we need the money. We're cash strapped, tech sells, it's popular with people. And they've kind of shifted position to think, well, okay, now we see what we've gotten out of that. How can we rethink our relationship with these companies? So it's council. Charles Allen in this iteration is key. Whether that is general across the city or not, I couldn't say. But what I would point out is if we go back to the beginning of these technologies, right? Uh-huh. What was said at the time was Uber is going to come into the city, for example, because the taxi industry is terrible, right? And everyone could agree on that. It is inefficient. It's, there's lack safety standards. There's, lack of uniformity. And above all, which you really see in the testimonies at the time, it is accused of being racist. It doesn't service certain parts of the city. And Uber is we can solve all those problems. To which the city says, great, because we can't, right? So if you can solve that problem in transit, great. And then we got all these other promises, little robots delivering food will solve food deserts, right?
Did Uber reduce the problem of taxis not wanting to go to certain parts of the city, mainly to the poor Black areas, southeast?
I think it's very difficult to prove. So part of this is a data issue. The companies don't share that data on a massive scale. So it's difficult for us to say whether the promises are being fulfilled or not. And then the majority of taxi drivers in DC are people of color as well. And, they get put out of work. So we can't evaluate whether they came true on that promise or not. We can only kind of, put together anecdotal evidence, qualitative research like we do, without being able to like definitively say, has it changed?
We haven't talked much about liability. Even if you were to ameliorate the safety problem, you still have the legal requirement to establish liability. Has anybody been able to come up with a workable way to understand this liability at this moment?
The city's position is that like the companies who operate the AVs should be ultimately liable, right, for anything that happens in them.
Did the ride-hailing companies, mainly Uber, but also some of the others, did they accept the liability problem and therefore cities were able to move forward? Or did cities cave in?
No, I think that they've accepted liability, background checks, mandating insurance, all these kinds of things. And there's lots of gray areas and complexities. But I think on the whole, we could say, and we have said, that the regulations are fairly minimal, but they do ensure basic kind of standards. In fact, in the case of Uber, most of the debate has been around other issues, and some of those are things like unemployment misclassification. The original pushback against Uber by the city way back in like 2012 was, we would like to ensure like a price floor, a minimum price that these workers should get paid. And, Uber is like, well, we're not going to do that. And so there's been a lot of the push over and back is actually about the labor process itself, who works and how they get paid and compensated and all that kind of stuff.
What about the idea with driverless cars that people that own them, not the company, not the platform, but if you buy one, then that's your insurance now?
We're in complete Wild West territory in terms of like how that could be legislated for. It's the same, say, for example, as if I have an extra apartment and I want to rent it out. You're a landowner now, so you're subject to new types of regulations and taxes and so on and so forth in order to monetize that thing, right? You're not living in it, you're using it. And so I think that would have to create a whole new category.
So Waymo and Zoox and others are not going to sell their cars. They're going to rent them out, correct? That is their plan?
Yeah, my understanding is that they own the fleet of vehicles, right? And then users pay to, get from A to B, right? It's like essentially a taxi system, right? And, that makes sense. One question I've always had there, which again, maybe is quite abstract, is like, how are they going to make money? The basis of the ride hailing model is essentially that like the drivers foot the costs of operation. They own the cars, they maintain the cars, and Uber just takes a cut of the fare. And that externalization of all those costs has been really crucial to how they make money. And in fact, for the longest time, they never even made money. And then now these companies are more or less operating as delivery services. My skepticism around how this is going to turn into a money-making opportunity remains. I think a lot of that original was fueled by, venture capital money. Like Uber sold off all those things back in 2019 and 20. And now they're just focusing on delivery, right? And so we have this disconnect. We were promised all these things, and now we have, migrant workers on mopeds zipping around the city, fulfilling the kind of this stuff.
Maybe Waymo will do the same thing. Maybe Zoox will do the same thing. And for Amazon, Zoox makes sense in that sense because they're already such a large delivery company that if they could automate deliveries, they don't really need to have passengers.
No, and they don't need to pay drivers. Delivery system makes sense. Although if you look at how deliveries work on a daily basis in the city, it's hard to imagine how they could be done autonomously, given that it more or less involves double parking and all kinds of illegal maneuvers to make sure the deliveries happen. So there's a whole lot of tacit knowledge that we all use and know how to navigate these things. And I can't imagine that being an automated system. But perhaps the technology will get there.
It doesn't have to look like a car. It can just be some sort of box that stands up in a 5x3 footprint. That's the parking. It's like a box. Just
yeah, it could, and it would park in much smaller spaces. And
I don't know how you put it. You do make deliveries to an apartment. I don't know. Maybe attach a drone on top, and that picks it up and does the last delivery by the window or something.
Who knows, right? Who knows, right? So this is where it gets very interesting, like, because like again, I think like when we like our default and my default position is always to go to the abstract, right? Like, what would the system look like? And we can imagine all kinds of fantastic things, and the technologies feel really kind of like tangible. They're close, right? It's like, well, you know, the car will come, and then it'll, like a little ramp will come, and a robot will come out, and then out of the robot will come a drone that will deliver, you know, whatever it is you bought to your apartment. And wonderful, right? But, you know, in the realm of the messy, complicated realm of actually living in the city, like there's all kinds of questions that, and this is why we elect politicians, to deal with this stuff. And it makes them seem like buzzkills, right? Like Luddites like myself. But that's what we elect them for, to do that boring, difficult, complicated political work to see what will this look like in practice. I'm always trying to get like hold these two things in tension. Like, what would be the concrete, like actual material changes that these things would make to cities, and how might that unfold, right? And how would it affect a city we live in with all its complications and differences and inequalities and so on? Versus what's the ideas, and what are the ideas at stake? Because to me, a lot of this stuff is fought in the realm of ideas. You know, that private companies are more efficient than the public, that more technology is automatically better. And in this big shift, in the, you know, our collective shift towards hating politics, right, there has been a switch as well between consumers and citizens. We think as consumers, we act as consumers. We're asked to vote and understand the city as consumers. And I'm not willing to accept I am just a consumer. And maybe I'm in the minority. I'm fully willing to accept that. But I like public park. I like that my kids go to public school. I like public libraries. I like public transit. Like, I like it. I like interacting with the city. I like living in it. I like feeling that I live in a community of people that I'm not disconnected to by platforms, that like we just text and app, like you use apps to kind of mediate those relationships. I think there's deep value in that. And all the research, urban research over the decades, and all the current research on social media show that we as humans need that. We value it. It's important. And that kind of idea is something that I think we need to get back on the agenda. And DC has a long history of it. Like, we built a subway. It's the Zach Schrag's wonderful book about it, The Great Society Subway. It's not just a transportation system. It's like, it's an idea of like what the city could be and why we're doing it. And we want people to have equal access and, you know, get around the city. All these things matter.
Declan Cullen, thank you for taking the time. I don't know how we can get people to stop hating politics, but sure as hell, I'm here trying.
Yeah, one day at a time. Thank you.
Find me in the crowd tonight, tongue-tied. Dance with me under cotton candy skies. We can leave the pain of the past behind, lean into the moment, dancing the night away. We can have whatever we want, start a renaissance. I could be a confidant, baby, won't you tell me what you want?
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics and government and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County native and now DC-based singer-songwriter Kara Levchenko's two new single releases, I Don't Mind and Tell Me What You Want. You can find her and her music at karalevchenko.com. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Go to bed. We can watch all the colored lights again. We can leave the pain of the past behind, lean into the moment, dancing the night away. We can have whatever we want, start a renaissance. I could be a confidant. Tell me what you want.